Hey, welcome to Feedback Def. I'm Sabby RK, the apostate music journalist, and I wanted to talk briefly about the upcoming Super Deluxe reissue box set of Deep Purple's classic album Machine Head. I just heard a few tracks off the digital advance that Rhino and Warner's sent to me, and it really struck me, so I wanted to talk about it quick and get into this broader story and feelings I have and questions I have for you about the whole trend of releasing new mixes of classic records. Something I have a lot of mixed feelings about. Machine Head is Deep Purple's most famous, most iconic record. It has never been my favorite of theirs. I am much more partial to the albums Who Do We Think We Are, which, funnily enough, people in the band have never liked, and Fireball. But I can't argue with why this record struck such a nerve. And so I pressed play knowing that Dweezil Zappa did the 2024 mix. And I was like expecting, well, I'll just say I was very, very struck, very impressed, much to my surprise. I was like, whoa. Because somehow, and I don't know what it is about it. I mean, this is purely subjective, but I'm not sure why. And again, I've only listened like 4 or 5 tracks in and then got really excited, wanted to talk about it. But there's something about Dweezil Zappa's mix that highlights some of the sounds more more thoroughly and more fully that were already there without compromising the character of the original mix. Again, I cannot put my finger on why this is. It just feels right to me. A lot of times, even with a remastering job, the way I've always described it is it's like if you walked into your room, a room you're very familiar with, and the room looks the same, like all the furniture is arranged in the same spots, but somehow the spatial relationships between those items have been slightly warped so that you walk into the room and something feels very off, like spatially it doesn't feel right to you. That's often what a remaster can do, or that can often be my response. Now, I can respond to a remaster like the remaster of Rush's Hemispheres by Reuben Cohen, who also did the remaster of Metallica's And Justice for All, and go, wow, this really is like the creme de la creme, exactly what I'm looking for, which is to bring more depth and polish, maybe not polish is the right word, but to sort of buff up and like enhance what's there, almost like a photo filter, but done in a super tasteful way, that you're not altering the character of the original mix. I should explain what the difference between mixing and mastering is in case you don't know. Here's how I think about it. If writing a song is drawing a sketch of a table that you eventually want to build and put in your house, arranging the song is drawing the schematic or the blueprints for how the parts are all going to fit together. Recording the song is making each of those individual parts of the table. So like a guitar part is one of the table legs, the bass is another table leg, the vocals are the top maybe, and the drums are like whatever, the foundation of the table. Mixing the song is assembling the table, the different parts into the actual table, and then mastering is adding a coat of varnish to that table. You could also go further and say that part of mixing is figuring out what room in the house that table is going to go in, and that mastering also entails doing the interior decoration once the table is in that room. Now, a lot of people think of mastering in purely technical terms, as if it's just a technician's process. Like it's like, I don't know, as straight ahead as like riveting, a bunch of screws down and you're good. But it's just as much an art as it is a science. It's not merely something like a procedure you get done on your mix by somebody who knows how to handle frequencies. The amount of knowledge you have to have with respect to frequency relationships and compression and all of these processes that are used in the mixing stage is enormous. But it is in some ways a separate discipline because you have almost an infinite amount of choice, right? You have all these different choices you can make on someone's mix and thus radically alter the character of that mix. Remastering is taking an old mix, the same mix that we all know, but then adding this other layer of different, like sanding away the original layer of varnish, or finding a version of the table that didn't have the varnish added yet, and then adding a different coat according to your own choices. You've got all kinds of choices. So a new master of an existing mix can sound super, super different. And obviously a completely new mix, of course, can sound super, super different. But a new mastering job can sound almost as different depending on the choices that the remastering engineer chooses to make. So again, you need all this technical know-how. You need to have a different kind of technical know-how, more of a holistic, and also at the same time microscopically focused and adept. You have to be able to see the mix at the microscopic level as well and have that aptitude. But then you're also an artist too, which is why remasters are hit or miss by definition, because it's like there's all sorts of things that the particular engineer or engineers can do very differently, even if it's the same person. Like my favorite is Rudy Van Gelder. My God, like, all those decades later, did all these incredible remastering jobs into the digital realm that sound just stunningly clear and beautiful and really preserve the spirit of those original recordings at Van Gelder Studios or wherever that was in Englewood Cliffs. But I mean, it's a very, 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 very easy thing to fuck up. Now, what I'll say about the Machine Head is I was expecting a remastering job. So I hit play and I thought that the first set of tracks would be the original mix, a new master of the original mix. And I was expecting that not to sound to my liking for some reason. I was expecting it to be like, well, maybe the original mix is thin and doesn't have enough body to translate into like the modern digital realm. So because I was expecting something kind of thin and not having enough presence, I heard the new mix and I'm like, whoa, this feels nice and round. It feels like you're walking into the music and it's all around you in 3D in a way that feels really pleasant to me. I noticed right away, pretty much a few seconds into it, I was like, whoa, this has to be the new mix. And, I've had examples like this. So in 2022, the Dead Kennedys released a new mix of their album Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables. And that mix was done by Chris LORD-ALGE, who is the brother of Tom LORD-ALGE and Jeff LORD-ALGE. They're all engineer producers. And I was like, oh, that's a strange choice, because I had just associated that last name with like more poppy, more big budget production stuff. Now, Chris LORD-ALGE has worked with like Tina Turner, but he's also done Green Day and other punk releases. But again, they're like more major label-y poppy stuff. So I was like, man, why would you do a new mix of a Dead Kennedys album with this person? And lo and behold, it knocked me out. I was like, again, very full. Still had the rawness of the original because I A-B'd them. And the personality and the kind of like bite and the hunger and the energy, just more full. Now, there are cases where I'm totally the opposite on. Steven Wilson of the band Porcupine Tree, he specializes in this. This is one of his specialties, doing new mixes and also surround mixes of classic records. He did a bunch of new mixes for the band Yes, and I can't listen to it. I just hear it and I'm like, oh. And that's not even a knock on what he did or his approach. There's just something about it. It's like a classic painting you've seen all your life. And then all of a sudden the colors are different. You're like, right? That can happen too. It's not even like there's any real technical basis other than just I'm used to it one way. Steven Wilson also did a new mix for I believe it was 2022 also, reissue of the Black Sabbath album Technical Ecstasy. And I am mixed on that. I'm like 50-50. I'm like, well, this is interesting because I'm hearing a bunch of things that I didn't in the original mix, which I thought was murky. But all along, I've been asking myself, well, why? I understand why people do remasters, but why do new mixes? Why? What is the point of doing this? I mean, other than the obvious, which is like, hey, this is an interesting twist on something familiar, and every time you hear about a new mix, you're just like sort of instantaneously curious, right? I just always feel naturally like, oh, I wonder what that sounds like. So, I mean, that answers the question. But from a more artistic standpoint, like someone like Steven Wilson, who takes what he does really seriously, the craft, the art, I'm just like, why do we need new renditions of these old records? In fact, so much so, I've got the perfect example. In 2020, one of my favorite bands ever, Failure, the alt metal trio out of LA, who got back together in 2014 or so, broke up in 1997, got back together in 2014, or something like that. So I reviewed their first reunion album, The Heart is a Monster, and then someone in their camp reached out to me and was like, we'd be interested in having you write the liner notes. We're doing this box set, and we're doing 2 new mixes. Ken Andrews is well known as an engineer-producer, and he did new mixes of the first 2 records. And it was interesting because, it ran the whole gamut, because the first album, as anyone who knows Failure knows, it's well documented. They did that record with Steve Albini, and they didn't see quite eye to eye with, even though they were fans of his work, with the Breeders and the Jesus Lizard. They were like super into his stuff with those bands. They got to Pachyderm, and it was like they didn't quite have as realized of a vision of where they wanted to go. They were really green. They hadn't been in the studio much, and then they took the record home, and it's like, this is not what we were expecting. So it always felt a little bit off to them. And so when I heard Ken Andrews' new mix of that, I'm like, oh, he made that first album finally sound like a Failure album. Like for me, it never quite fit in with the rest of their stuff. But then you go to their second album, which is probably my favorite album by them, and I couldn't. Again, I was like, no, I can't. There were some interesting points where I was hearing like a new, it's almost like getting a panoramic shot of something you had a postcard of, right? Or like you've had this postcard sitting on your wall, right? But then you get to see the full photo or something, or like a raw photo before that photo got stylized into the postcard, And so you're like, oh, I'm seeing a bunch of different details that I hadn't noticed before, but my bond with that record is so strong, I couldn't listen to it. And then he decided, and I think wisely, to leave the third album completely alone, just like not touch that mix. And his thinking was, well, we did that ourselves anyway, so why do I need to do that? He was thinking, well, I had always had these ideas for those first 2 records going way back when, so now I finally get to see those ideas through. But I always feel like, well, you're not the same person you were back then. You're not using the same gear. Your like cells are not the same. You can't get into who that person was 30 years ago and make those same choices they would have made. It's kind of like you just kind of have to let it be. And also, I adore the mix on their second album, Magnified. So, whatever else they wanted to do to it, I'm like, I'm good with what it is. This is the first time we, the public, heard that record, and we know it in that form. So I don't know what the point is. I mean, this is basically like director's cuts, kind of, or it's not quite the right analogy. It'd be like bringing in a new editor to edit a film. and do a new cut of a film. And again, director's cuts strike me as odd because if it's the film you turned in, like when Ridley Scott turned in Blade Runner, I'm cool with the director's cut, like a reissue. I don't know that that's been re-released many, many times, but in principle, it's like, that's the film I turned in. That's the film I wanted them to release. I'm cool with releasing that. But then going back, like what he did with Alien, which was a different story, he was just like, you know what? I just felt like doing a new cut of this, just, gives the fans something to kind of chew on. It's like tampering, right? Or is it? I mean, you could look at it that way, but I guess for me, it's a case-by-case basis. One of the people I spoke with to do the liners for that Failure box set was Sam Fogarino, the drummer from Interpol. And he got into the band big time right from when he heard that Steve Albini produced first album. So I'd be curious to know, for someone like that, what it was like to hear the new version when the whole character was changed. Would it be a thing where like, oh, these two can exist side by side, and I like them both. It's just a new angle on something I already love, versus, oh, I'd rather stick with the one that I first fell in love with. Steve Albini, in fact, as a case in point, for the 20th anniversary edition of Nirvana's In Utero that was released in 2013, Albini did a new mix, an entirely new mix of that record, which is obviously a hugely iconic album. And I actually was intrigued by that, and I thought that he was really thoughtful in explaining what his whole purpose, like what the intention was for doing that. It was meant more, at least the way I understood it, to be a companion that just kind of gave you new insights and a new way of getting to know this album that had gotten so familiar over time because it's so iconic. Which is not at all to say that Ken Andrews wasn't thoughtful or intentional in his new mixes of the first two Failure albums. In fact, quite to the contrary. That band has always had, other than, their first sort of naive, I guess, forays into recording, once they got their bearings, Ken Andrews and Greg Edwards doing demos at home in like 1993, from that point on, it was off to the races, and it's been that way ever since. They're quite defined in what they're trying to accomplish. I guess my point is, though, that you can love something so much that any new representation of it can get in the way. Like, I'm not as attached to In Utero, not even by like miles and miles, as I am to Magnified. So In Utero, I can listen to as a curiosity if it's like retouched in some way. Whereas something like Magnified, I'm more protective of my memory of the original experience. And true story, my copy of the Failure box set is sitting in the other room, still unopened. That's a story for another day, but it's been sitting in the box for almost 4 years since it arrived. I am planning on doing an unboxing on my channel. I might even do that live at some point, so stay tuned. Anyway, speaking of being protective, in 2022, the Police, or the label A&M, Universal, re-released Ghost in the Machine, one of my absolute Desert Island discs. This is one of my favorite, like, things that has ever existed on Earth, right? They released what was called the original sequence, and they put the word original in scare quotes. And I'm like, I tried to find out, well, wait, why are they calling it the original? What's the story behind this? Like, and they didn't have any information. I heard it, and it completely changed the record. This is not really a new mix, although there were new interludes between the songs. This was just a new sequence, and holy moly, was it different. Again, I was like, turn it off, turn it off, turn it off, even though I was the one turning it off. But if like I had been somewhere and it had come on, I'd be like, turn it off, I can't listen to it, stop. So, I mean, I can have a really, really strong reaction to these things, and yet, the new Deep Purple, hats off to Dweezil Zappa. I'm not saying you will feel this way. I'm sure lots of people who have like known and loved and cherished that album and have heard it on the radio, Smoke on the Water on the radio, fucking, 8 trillion times. I'm sure they might be taken aback, a lot of them, but there's something about this one, a lot like the Dead Kennedys, that it just enlivens what's there in this way that feels fresh but also completely faithful to the to what this work is. Of course, Machine Head and the song Smoke on the Water specifically is famous because like famous or like the well-documented story about how the band Deep Purple, they were in Montreux, Switzerland. They were about to record in a studio, but Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention were there, and somebody with a flare gun burned down the studio. So they had to scramble and do the album with a mobile recording unit in this really like weird way. They had cables going like, lots and lots of feet, and yet came up with their most iconic record in their entire catalog. And that's what the song Smoke on the Water is about. There's, of course, the line, Frank Zappa and the Mothers, some stupid with a flare gun, blah, 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 burned the place to the ground. Maybe because Smoke on the Water is so overplayed and is so iconic and is so wedged into the fabric of classic rock. Maybe, maybe the thinking is, hey, let's do something, let's freshen this up a little bit. Let's move the lighting around this painting and or move it to a different room in the museum, in the gallery, just to kind of get people seeing it from a new angle and a new light. And it's working for me. I'm really, really excited actually about this in a way that I completely wasn't expecting. I also gotta say, I interviewed Deep Purple vocalist Ian Gillan in 2006. And when I was doing the research for that interview, I was expecting this total lunkhead of a guy, largely because of the first song on Machine Head, Highway Star. It's a super famous song of theirs. It's a classic. I love that song. But because of the words, nobody gonna take my car, gonna race it to the ground, nobody gonna beat my car, it's gonna break the speed of sound. Ooh, it's a killing machine. It's got everything. Like a driving power, big fat tires and everything. And then later, years later, when Ian Gillan was in Black Sabbath briefly, he wrote a song called Trashed, which is basically Highway Star, but with booze, right? Like drunk driving on the grounds of the studio where they were recording and fucking around most of the time and flipping cars over. So I'm expecting to talk like on that level. And then I do research and I come across this interview on this awesome YouTube channel named Face Culture. I'll link to it in the notes. And Ian Gillan is talking about how at 8 years old, he was contemplating infinity and life after death. And he's like, and then when a mother feels in her heart that her son has passed on the battlefield, how is that she feels that? And I'm like, whoa, this is not what I was expecting. And he mentions this book named Flatland by Edwin Abbott. This is a book written in the 1880s. Abbott was a schoolmaster, but also a priest and a theologian. And it's an examination of how there might be more dimensions than we are aware of by setting the story in a two-dimensional realm. So I read this in like 10th grade geometry, loved the book. And Ian Gillan mentions this book in this Face Culture interview. So I'm like, whoa. So I start my interview off with him mentioning that book, and we're off and running, and it was a great interview. I remember getting a note from his publicist saying, Ian loved it. I'm going to have to dig that up and dust off the audio and post it because it was a career highlight for me, and it was pretty early in my career. And he was just a joy to talk to. Really, really deep, interesting, fun, funny guy who is not at all represented really by the lyrics on this album. Although some of them are, that's not entirely fair because Maybe I'm a Leo and other songs like that are more serious and more contemplative, but I had no idea. And I just love the contrast. Like I've always loved Highway Star, but I love it even more now, knowing that the guy singing that was thinking about infinity at 8 years old. I think that is awesome. So I'm curious what you think about these releases. what do they do for you? Like, how curious do you get whenever someone's like, oh, we're releasing this album, and it's got the original mix remastered, and it's got this new mix, and then of course it's got the Dolby or the Quad or what's the other, Surround, Dolby, Atmos, none of which I have really gotten into because I don't have the speaker systems for that. It's really, really funny. My old boss, when I worked at a recording studio many moons ago here in the Western New York City I live in, mostly recording like high school and 20-something local bands, I remember asking him, I said, oh, what do you think of 5.1 mixes? He goes, do you have 5.1 fucking ears? And he just shrugged his shoulders. And, that sounds like a closed-minded, shaking fisted cloud take, but it really isn't when you consider this. I showed him the back page. I believe it was written by the publisher Larry Crane of the magazine Tape Op, the recording magazine. I showed him an issue of an editorial titled A Mono Proposal. And this was a sort of semi-serious, somewhat satirical but serious proposal, if I remember the tone correctly, that all engineers should learn to mix in mono first. Like the sort of sensationalist angle was we should all go back to mono, which wasn't really what the author meant. It was more like the original recording engineers who worked in mono. I remember this line. This I'm pretty sure is verbatim. Learned how to coax depth out of a mono field. There was no stereo field. And I ran that by my old boss, Tony, and he was like, yeah, no, that's totally true. Like you should learn how to create a sense of space in mono first before you start doing things even in stereo. And stereo originally, shout out to my guy Don Anonymous, aka Don Blair, aka Professor Anonymous. He has said to me, stereo was kind of a gimmick when it first started. It was like, oh, we're going to do these versions for all these people who bought these like stereo sets for home. And, the print on the record that says the new stereo mix was like as big as the album title because they wanted to kind of throw you this bone of like, here's this new thing you can try at home. Whereas the mono mixes at a certain period in pop music and rock music, the mono mixes were more serious, were the ones that more concentration went into at first. I do think that's interesting. Obviously I'm not going to argue with like what Jimi Hendrix and Pink Floyd and people like that. And George Martin, of course, started to do with stereo. But I do think it's important to imagine what you can do when you don't have that option. Can you have somebody walk into a room and hear a mono mix that does not have this like imposed sense of spread? Can you have somebody walk into that room and feel like they're in the space of the music? And you absolutely can. You listen to stuff from the mono era. I mean, you listen to Phil Spector. I mean, it sounds incredible. So I'm not really like super jazzed on Atmos mixes. I'm sure like if you go into a movie theater and you hear one of your favorite songs from, a classic album and it's in a movie in like fucking Transformers or something and the sound is all over you, I'm sure that can sound incredible. I don't know that I need to do that in my private listening space. It just seems like a lot of a production to do it. And also it seems like more and more and more levels that new choices can end up taking you further from what the original thing was. Even if it's the same person who mixed the original thing. They're not doing them both on the same day, right? They're doing them years and years and years later. And I know Steven Wilson takes this very seriously. He did the Seeds of Love album by Tears for Fears. He did the surround or Atmos mixes for those. And he talked about, what an honor that was and how he approached those choices. I just feel like it's a little bit kind of like a circus trick. I'm sure Steven Wilson would totally disagree or people who have come to listen to this format. But I mean, you want to create surround sound, all you need is one speaker and the room you're in and the way the sound bounces off that room in that space, if we really want to get down to it. Again, I'm sure I could hear Atmos mixes and I'd be like, wow, this sounds incredible. You know, there's also those speakers that simulate like the whatever that thing is. I wish I knew the name and had looked this up beforehand, but there's this like sweet spot of like imagined like psychoacoustic space where there's this third space, almost like a third eye sonically, right between where your speakers are. And some people have tried to go for that or have actually put a speaker in that space, that kind of thing. It's all very interesting. You know, look, you can totally change the character of an album just from remastering alone, to say nothing of doing a new mix of it. But I'm always asking, well, why? What is the point of doing this? And yet every time I hear about a new mix, I'm always curious and cautious at the same time. So whatever marketing idea these people have in mind when they take on these projects, it's working, or at least it's working on me. It doesn't always make me want to go buy the thing, but I'm always curious. And again, with a lot of trepidation, because sometimes I'm like, oh no. The Pink Floyd Animals new mix. It's the 2018 mix, which was released in 2022 because there was like legal wrangling or disagreements between Waters and on the one side and Gilmour and Mason on the other. That's a case where Pink Floyd turned in a mix of the record, then the record company asked them to do another one, and that's the one the world got in 1970 whatever, so 79 I believe it was, and then, or 77, and then they did a new one in 2018, and I think you can get your hands on all three. So I'm like, okay, why didn't they just highlight the original one more? That would be the one for me that's the most exciting, because that's kind of like the director's cut of Animals, right? It's like, hey, here's the one we turned in. Again, I don't know Animals enough, and I wouldn't want to get attached to one of these albums in their new form. I would want to sit with the original, let that imprint on my brain, and then see how the new one sits with me. But then when you do that, you're kind of handicapping the chances of the new one impressing you. There was, of course, also the Replacements Tim box set with the new mix. So there's a lot of cases of this, and that's an album that had really ratty production values to begin with. So I understand the need to make it sound more full. But every time you take this chance, you're risking sort of going off the deep end and kind of almost marring the original thing you made. Obviously, I guess it's worth the risk. People keep doing it, and they're going to keep doing it anyway, regardless of what I say. Very curious to know what you think. The new Deep Purple Super Deluxe Machine Head is out March 29th, 2024. I may be doing some more on it and maybe discussing more of these examples on my channel. If you're into it, we'll see how it goes. Feedback Def, I'm Sabby Reyes Kulkarni, the Apostate Music Journalist. Thanks for joining me. Over and out.